Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here. How stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
Welcome to Strange Things, broadcasting from the Arkanasa Radio Studios in Laredo, Texas. And welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. This is Saturday, December 2nd, 2017. Yes, it's time to start saying Merry Christmas once more. Not Happy Holidays. It's Merry Christmas. Tonight, we're going to be talking about D.B. Cooper. The reason for the show? 46 years ago, this last Monday, D.B. Cooper jumped from an airplane with $200,000. On the evening before Thanksgiving, November 24th, 1971, a man identified himself as Dan Cooper purchased a one-way ticket on Flight 305, a 30-minute trip to Seattle, Washington. The plane was a Boeing 727-100. This particular aircraft had stairs that opened from the rear of the fuselage. He was wearing a nondescript black suit, a white shirt, black tie. He was carrying a black briefcase. He also had a black raincoat or an overcoat with him. The man known as Dan went and sat in the rear section of the plane. This was back when you could smoke on an airplane. He lit a Raleigh filter-tipped cigarette and sat back and waited for takeoff. There were about 36 passengers and 6 flight crew on the plane, but few, if any, paid any attention to Dan. Think about the last time you flew. What did the man sitting behind you look like? How about today when you stopped for gas? Do you remember what the clerk looked like? This all led to the general lack of a reliable description of Dan sometime later. Once in the air, Dan asked for a bourbon and soda. When stewardess Florence Schaffner handed him his drink, Dan passed her a note. She slipped the note into her pocket without bothering to read it. Men used to hit on the flight staff all the time. Some people thought they were there for more than just service while in flight. Dan got Florence's attention and told her maybe she should read the note. Florence was doing her job, part of which was keeping the passengers happy, and so she pulled the paper out of her pocket and had a look. The note was printed in neat, all-capital letters using a felt-tip pen. Anybody remember using felt-tip pens all the time? The note said something to the effect, the man had a bomb in his briefcase, and she was to advise the captain as to his wishes. Florence sat down next to the passenger, and he opened the briefcase, showing Florence what looked to be a bomb. I'll bet her blood ran cold as she looked at what, for all intents and purposes, was the instrument of her soon death. Now she had to act naturally as she made her way to the flight deck and told the pilot what was going on in the rear of the plane. Dan had told Florence he wanted the plane to continue to Seattle, Washington. There was to be a fuel truck standing by. He wanted $200,000 in U.S. currency and 4 parachutes. Why 4 parachutes? The idea being transmitted to the authorities was they had best not try to sabotage the chutes in an attempt to foil his getaway. One of the flight crew might just be forced to jump out of the plane with the hijacker. No one on the ground wanted to be responsible for killing one of the crew. The $200,000 doesn't sound like much today, but it would have been $1,200,000 in today's currency. Dan could have asked for more, but he probably was thinking about how much a bag full of money was going to weigh as he jumped from the plane. A friend of mine was an airborne ranger. He carried a squad assist machine gun. All of his equipment had to be strapped to his body before he exited the plane. The weapon was tied along his leg, making walking near impossible. In order to get him to the door and out of the plane, his compadres had to all but carry him and throw him out. $200,000 in 20s would weigh about 40 pounds. That's 10,000 individual bills. You can't hang on to 40 pounds of anything, no matter how strong you might be, when you pull the ripcord on a parachute. Had Dan jumped from the plane holding the money, he would have lost all of his hard-earned, ill-gotten gains, making the whole trip pretty much a waste of time. The pilot, William Scott, announced the flight was having equipment trouble, and they would have to wait before the plane could land. The 30-minute flight turned into a 2-hour flight, since the plane circled the airport waiting for the cash to be collected together. Northwest Orient Flight 305 finally landed in Seattle. The money had been gathered in order to pay the ransom and hopefully keep the air crew and the plane intact. Every bill had the serial number recorded. A group of people were brought together and all the money was piled in the middle of the table. Everyone grabbed a handful and started writing. 10,000 bills had to be looked at and the numbers written down. This was why the landing had to be delayed for 2 hours. Dan had also requested food be delivered to the plane for the flight crew. Once on the ground, Northwest Orient, Seattle's operations manager, Al Lee, removed his uniform and put on civilian clothes so he wouldn't be mistaken for a police officer. He carried the 4 parachutes and a banker's bag with $200,000 out to the plane and handed it to flight attendant Mucklow. With the money and parachutes now on board the plane, Dan allowed all the passengers, as well as 2 of the flight attendants, Florence Schaffner and senior flight attendant Alice Hancock, to leave the plane. Florence had had the most contact with Dan, so she was questioned as to his looks and attitude. She told the FBI that Dan had looked very calm and relaxed. He was able to identify landmarks on the ground as they flew over them. He knew a lot about the terrain as well as the workings of the aircraft. She said Dan had been very polite and he showed concern for the flight crew. None of the other passengers had the slightest idea they were participants in a possible life-and-death event until the FBI began questioning them. The feds wanted to know about one of the passengers who had stayed on the plane. There you are, late at night. Your flight has gone from 30 minutes to 2 hours. As you're exiting the plane, one of the passengers stayed in his seat. What did he look like? Most people are so focused on their own situation, they seldom, if ever, look around and memorize those around them. The FBI did manage to pull together a description using all of the witnesses' statements. And we're going to take a brief pause here, play a couple of commercials, and drink some coffee. So don't go away. We'll be right back after this. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Do you have skin? Would you like to take better care of it? Call Lourdes James, independent beauty consultant, and set up an appointment. call 723-3019. Coffee, nectar of the gods. And at the Organic Man Coffee Trike, you'll find coffee made the right way, one delicious cup at a time. Stop on by 4501 McPherson, Suite number 9. And remember, life is too short to drink bad coffee. If your vision isn't what it used to be, and you're not sure you're seeing Bigfoot or just your neighbor mowing his lawn, stop on by Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle del Norte, just across the street from the Embassy Suites. You should be able to see what you're looking at. Did you hear a bump in the night and you think it just might be a ghost? Contact the Laredo Paranormal Research Society at laredoparanormal@hotmail.com. That's the LPRS for all your otherworldly needs.
No, don't say goodbye. Stay with us. This is Arcanasa Radio. Quédate con nosotros. Estás escuchando Arcanasa Radio.
And welcome back to the show. We were just talking about D.B. Cooper and the hijacking of Flight 305 out of Seattle, Washington. The FBI was questioning all the passengers as well as the two flight attendants. They said that Dan looked to be about 5'10" to 6 feet tall. I kind of wonder how accurate this size was, since Dan was sitting down the entire time he was in sight. The witnesses said he had dark brown or black hair. He had on a white shirt with a thin black necktie. His suit was black as well. Some said it was high-quality suit, while others claimed it was kind of cheap-looking. The man had a black raincoat or overcoat, as well as a black briefcase. All in all, this description could be a lot of folks out there, but this was all the feds had to go on. Cooper told the remaining crew to close all the window screens to prevent a sniper from shooting him. Dan got busy telling the pilots what he wanted them to do next. The plane was to take off and fly south. The landing gear was to remain down. The flaps were to be set at 15 degrees. They were to fly at 120 miles an hour at 10,000 feet. The cabin was to remain unpressurized. There was to be no communications with the ground at all. The pilot told Cooper the plane could not reach 1,000 miles if they had to use all of his instructions. Cooper agreed to allow a second refueling landing in Reno, Nevada. Flight 305 departed Seattle Airport en route to Reno at 7:40 p.m. Once in the air, Cooper told Flight Attendant Mucklow to join the rest of the crew in the cockpit and stay there. No one was to come aft during the rest of the flight. Two F-106 fighter aircraft had scrambled from McCord Air Force Base, and they fell in behind the airline. One above and one just below, well out of Cooper's view. A Lockheed T-33, an Air National Guard trainer, also was shadowing the 727. At about 8 p.m., a light came on the instrument panel, showing that the rear stairs were opening. The pilot called over the intercom to ask what was going on, but Dan told him to ignore the light. The plane continued flying south for Reno, when about 15 minutes later, the plane rocked around as if some weight had been dropped from the stairs. The flight crew assumed Cooper had jumped from the rear stairs. The night was cold and dark. At 10,000 feet, it would be about 60 degrees, plus the wind. Cold, but not freezing cold. The pilot was concerned the hijacker would be able to listen in on any radio transmissions, so he didn't contact the authorities on the ground until about to land in Reno. They weren't sure he had jumped, they just assumed he had. As they were coming into Reno, the pilot contacted ground control to tell them he was going to have to land with the rear stairs down. This would make coming in a bit of a hassle, but not impossible. The stairs were part way up due to the force of the wind anyway. Once on the ground, the plane was surrounded by police who boarded the plane only to find Cooper was indeed gone. When the pilot told the authorities about the in-flight turbulence at 8:15, everyone assumed Cooper had jumped from the rear stairs while the plane was over southwest Washington. Now the search was on. Local, state, and federal authorities began combing the woods all along the southern border of Washington. Hundreds of police, the sheriff's deputies, park rangers, and volunteers walked through every field, woodland, countryside, looking for any evidence of Cooper having landed in the area. The three planes that had been following Flight 305 never spotted anyone jumping from the plane, but it was late at night and the skydiver would have been hard to see. No evidence was ever found that would indicate Dan Cooper had come down in southwest Washington. When authorities released the story about the hijacking, the press screwed the name up and somehow went from Dan Cooper to D.B. Cooper. How this happened is anyone's guess. The papers were filled with stories of how D.B. Cooper had pulled off the crime of the century. The news reporters all began giving out the official story about how D.B. Cooper had jumped from Flight 305 and vanished into the woods below. In 1981, the movie The Pursuit of D.B. Cooper came out. It mostly went along with the accepted idea that Cooper had jumped over the woods in Washington. Agents came up with the theory that the hijacker had used the name Dan Cooper, which he had gotten from a popular Belgian comic book series in the 1970s. The fictional character, Dan Cooper, was a Royal Canadian Air Force test pilot who took part in numerous heroic adventures, including parachuting into action to save the day. The hijacker might have been familiar with this series had he grown up in Canada or lived in Belgium. With no other name to call him, the name D.B. Cooper has been used ever since. The FBI searched the plane and came up with some ideas left behind by Dan Cooper. Firstly, he had removed his necktie and left it on the seat. The tie was an ordinary piece of menswear found in most clothing stores. They weren't able to glean any clues as to who had worn the tie. There were hundreds of fingerprints found all over the area of the plane occupied by D.B. Cooper, but the glass he drank from, as well as the molding around the seat and the magazine he was reading, had all been wiped down before Cooper left the plane. It seems he'd kept careful track of anything he touched. He'd also taken the ransom note from Florence Schaffner after she had read it. The ashtray held the butts of 8 Raleigh cigarettes. At the time, there was no such thing as lifting DNA from anything. DNA wasn't even known of at the time. The cigarettes were bagged and tagged and then lost. Incredibly, somebody managed to misplace the evidence of what was known as the crime of the century. Oops. Would the DNA be usable after all these years? Ashlyn Brown, a forensics investigator, said, DNA is a lot tougher than most people would think. So, should someone ever stumble upon a bag full of old cigarette butts and run the DNA sequencing, they just might find some of D.B. Cooper's DNA. I just hope the chain of evidence is still intact. Otherwise, the butts will just be trash found on an airplane. When no one was caught out in the woods of southwest Washington, Plan B went into effect. The authorities waited for somebody to try spending some of the money used in the ransom. All the bills had their serial numbers written down, and so the wait was on. Just as soon as the numbers were discovered in either a bank or other location, the authorities would swoop in and begin looking for fingerprints and track down the hijacker that way. As time went by, none of the bills used to pay off the hijacker ever turned up. Even had Cooper managed to launder the bills, the numbers would still have turned up sometime. Had Mr. Cooper snuck out of the country with the money and spent it in, say, Europe, the bills would still have found their way back to the U.S. at some time after the hijacking. This pretty much negates the idea that Cooper ever spent any of the money he received from Northwest Orient Airlines. The official story changed to say D.B. Cooper had successfully exited the plane, only to die out in some unexplored part of the wilderness. They said that, to begin with, Cooper didn't know how to use a parachute, based on his choosing a military chute over the sports chute. Shows a clear lack of experience. Recently, on a TV special, someone finally got around to asking a military skydiver with hundreds of jumps under his belt what he thought about Cooper's choice in parachutes. The expert said not only did Cooper pick the right chute, but it was the only one that would have given the best control and serviceability under the conditions that Cooper had jumped under. Next, the authorities pointed to the reserve chute Cooper picked as being blatantly ignorant since the chute was not actually serviceable. It had been sent by accident and wouldn't actually open. Perhaps when Cooper was looking over the parachutes afforded him, he discovered the bogus chute and simply threw it out the back of the plane. Regardless, he did jump from the plane and get away. The sports chute given to Cooper had been opened, and some of the paracord and a bit of silk were removed. One idea that came up later in the hunt was that Cooper never actually had any explosives to begin with. Perhaps he had flares that, when viewed by a shook-up stewardess, looked like sticks of dynamite. Cooper could have tied pieces of silk to the flares and dropped them from the stairs to judge wind speed and elevation. This sounds like a good theory, but the three planes following behind Flight 305 would have seen the flares in the darkness as they dropped from the plane. Another theory was that Cooper used the sports chute to manufacture a harness to attach the money to his body, so when the chute opened, the money wouldn't be yanked from his grasp. Had this been the case, this would show Dan Cooper was a lot more familiar with skydiving than the authorities were willing to admit. The FBI came out and said Cooper would have died in the freezing cold night sitting out in the forest once he had landed. Remember, the air temperature was only 60 degrees at 10,000 feet. The temperature on the ground would have been a lot nicer, say in the 70s. Who is going to die from exposure in 70-degree weather when they have a coat and a suit on? Remember those flares? Maybe he kept one or two to help start a fire. He seemed to think of just about everything, so why not think about what he was going to do once he was on the ground? In February 1980, Brian Ingram was digging in the sand on Tina's Bar in the Columbia River when he uncovered 3 bundles of money, $5,880 just in face value. The cash was badly deteriorated, but the serial numbers were still readable. The 8-year-old had found a portion of the ransom money paid to D.B. Cooper. The site of the discovery was downriver from where everybody said Cooper had jumped. This added fuel to the theory Cooper had come down in the river and drowned. The cash was held the cash was held together by rubber bands. This would seem a bit odd since rubber bands don't have a very good staying power. If left on their own, in a nice dark drawer in a cool climate, rubber bands will still fall apart in a matter of a few years, let alone 8 years. Rubber bands exposed to water and the elements would fall apart within about 200 days. So how is it possible for the 3 bundles of cash found at Tina's bar to still be held together? The rubber should have given up the fight a long time ago, and the bundles should have been scattered about instead of staying in one place. The bills were eventually returned to Brian, who was able to sell them for as much as several $1,000s for a bill in reasonable shape. Just a small piece was worth several $100s. As far as suspects go, there have been a lot over the last 47 years. We'll get into these in just a few seconds after we play a couple commercials and drink some coffee. So don't go away. We'll be right back after this. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Are you taking care of your skin, or are you going to wait and see how time treats you? Take care today by contacting Lourdes James, Independent Beauty Consultant, at 956-723-3019. Don't let time get the best of you. Be sure and check out the Majestical Cryptid for all your latest cryptid needs. That's the majesticalcryptid.net. Coffee makes the world go round. And around here, we have the Organic Man Coffee Trike, 4501 McPherson, Suite number 9. If you're not looking for coffee, try their tea. It's the best in town. And remember, life is too short to drink bad coffee. If you need to squint and hold things out at arm's length to see them, maybe you should get your eyes checked. Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle del Norte, is right across from the Embassy Suites. Stop squinting and start seeing. This is Arkanasa Radio you've been listening to. And welcome back to the show. We were just about to start going over some of the suspects that have been implicated in the D.B. Cooper hijacking. To begin with, whoever the hijacker was, he knew about the aft staircase. Few people knew the stairs could be lowered while the plane was in flight. A few people knew the stairs couldn't be controlled from the cockpit. Few people in the airline industry knew you could use these stairs to jump from the 727 while it was in the air, as long as the plane flew at 120 miles an hour. The people that knew these things were those who worked for the CIA and were involved in covert air operations. This information was a closely guarded secret, since the CIA didn't want any of their secrets getting out. Without the above information, the FBI began looking into suspects that would have been ruled out had they known about the staircase. Theodore E. Mayfield was Army Special Forces. He was a pilot and a competitive skydiver. He also worked as a skydiving instructor. Mayfield served time in 1994 after being found guilty of negligent homicide after 2 of his students were killed using faulty equipment. Both died after their parachutes failed to open. Mayfield was later found indirectly responsible for 13 additional skydiving deaths. All of these deaths were due to faulty equipment and bad training. Mayfield was also guilty of armed robbery and transportation of a stolen aircraft. In 2010, he was given 3 years probation when it was discovered he was piloting a plane 26 years after losing his pilot's license. He was also found guilty of using counterfeit certificates. He came up as a suspect repeatedly over the years, but each time he was ruled out. According to the FBI agent Ralph Himmelsbach, Mayfield was ruled out based on the fact he had called Himmelsbach less than 2 hours after Flight 305 landed in Reno, volunteering advice on standard skydiving practices and landing zones. In 2006, 2 amateur researchers and writers named Daniel Dvorak and Matthew Mayers offered Mayfield as a suspect once more. They theorized that Mayfield called Himmelsbach not to offer advice, but to establish an alibi. Mayfield denies any involvement and repeatedly said the FBI had called him 5 times while the hijack was still in progress to ask about parachutes. Himmelsbach said the FBI did not call Mayfield. The 2 writers never released their book. Maybe they figured out Mayfield wasn't the hijacker, and this kind of put the information in their book in a bit of a crimp. Jack Kofelt was a con man, ex-convict, and self-proclaimed government informant. He liked to tell people he had been the chauffeur and confidant of Abraham Lincoln's last known descendant, great-grandson Robert Todd Lincoln Beckwith. In 1972, Kofelt claimed he was D.B. Cooper. Using a former cellmate named James Brown, not the singer, Kofelt wanted to sell his story to the Hollywood production company. Jack Kofelt said he had come down hard near Mount Hood. He injured both his legs and somehow managed to lose the ransom money at the same time. The photos of Kofelt do bear a striking resemblance to drawings of D.B. Cooper, but he was in his mid-50s in 1971, and Cooper was said to be in his mid-40s. Kofelt was in Portland, Oregon at the time of the hijacking, and he did get injured in a skydiving accident. Kofelt was interviewed by the FBI, and they determined he didn't know enough of the details surrounding the hijacking. The only things Kofelt could tell the feds were details found in any newspaper. Kofelt was ruled out as being D.B. Cooper and listed as being a want-to-be celebrity seeker. The story about his being a chauffeur for Lincoln's descendant were shown to be made up as well. Robert Wesley Rackstraw served in Vietnam as a helicopter crewman. He received parachute training while in the Army. After the war, he got his pilot's license and managed to retire before heading to Iran. While there, Rackstraw was arrested and deported for possession of explosives and check fraud. Once back in the United States, Rackstraw tried to fake his own death by flying out over Monterey Bay and then making a bogus Mayday call, claiming he was going down and was bailing out over water. The authorities found Rackstraw alive and well at an airport, and the so-called downed plane was in a hangar nearby with a bogus tail number. Cooper investigators took a look at Rackstraw but quickly ruled him out as being too young and totally lacking of any of the ties that would have put him in with the hijacking. Richard McCoy was an Army veteran who served 2 tours in Vietnam, first as a demolitions expert, and later he flew a helicopter transporting the Green Beret. Once he got out of the military, McCoy became a warrant officer in the Utah National Guard. He began recreational skydiving, which he soon became very proficient at. He told folks he was thinking of joining the Utah State Police. April 7, 1972, McCoy staged the best-known D.B. Cooper copycat hijacking. He boarded United Airlines Flight 855 that just happened to be a Boeing 727 with the aft stairs in Denver, Colorado. McCoy pulled a hand grenade from his pocket, which was actually just a paperweight. He said he was going to blow up the plane and everybody in it if he didn't get his demands. He wanted 4 parachutes and $500,000. The authorities delivered the money and parachutes to San Francisco International Airport. McCoy ordered the aircraft back into the sky and then he jumped out over Provo, Utah. He was doing okay, but for a few details. McCoy had left his handwritten hijacking note with the flight crew. His fingerprints were all over the magazine he'd been reading. He was arrested on April 9th with the ransom cash still in his possession. After his conviction, McCoy received a 45-year sentence. 2 years into his prison sentence, he escaped from Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary. McCoy and a few fellow inmates used a garbage truck to ram through the front gate. McCoy made his way to Virginia Beach, Virginia, where 3 months later he was killed in a shootout with police. In a book that came out in 1991 called D.B. Cooper, The Real McCoy, Bernie Rhodes, a former parole officer, and a retired FBI agent, Russell Calum, said they had come to the conclusion that McCoy was D.B. Cooper. They showed some of the similarities between the 2 hijackings. McCoy's family came forward saying that the tie and the mother-of-pearl tie clip left on Flight 305 definitely belonged to McCoy. McCoy had refused to either admit or deny that he was Daniel Cooper. The FBI agent who shot McCoy said, "When I shot Richard McCoy, I shot D.B. Cooper at the same time." He might have thought he shot D.B. Cooper, but there were too many discrepancies. McCoy was in Las Vegas when D.B. Cooper was in the process of hijacking Flight 305. McCoy didn't match the composite drawings of Cooper. Lastly, McCoy was at home having Thanksgiving dinner when Cooper would have been wandering about the wilderness. Dwayne L. Weber was a World War II Army veteran who served time in at least 6 prisons from 1945 to 1968. He was in for anything from burglary to forgery. Based on a deathbed confession, his widow contacted the FBI and passed on his story. 1995, 3 days before he died, Weber told his wife, "I am Dan Cooper." To his wife, this meant nothing, but when she did some research, she discovered who he had claimed to be. She recalled that Weber had a nightmare during which he was talking in his sleep. He said things to the effect of jumping from a plane and leaving his fingerprints on the aft stairs. He also reportedly told her that an old knee injury was from when he jumped out of a plane. One piece of evidence that got attention was a 1979 trip to Seattle and the Columbia River. During this time, Weber had taken a walk along the riverbank near Tina's bar. This was 4 months before Brian Ingram found the 3 bundles of ransom money buried in the sand. The FBI eliminated Weber as the suspect in July 1998 when his fingerprints didn't match any of those found on board Flight 305. No direct evidence could be found to implicate Weber in the hijacking. Then there are the people the FBI didn't consider to be suspects, mostly because they had come to the conclusion as to what D.B. Cooper knew about skydiving. Sometimes the FBI will come to a conclusion about a suspect and then pursue evidence that will support their idea. Plus, they really hate it when someone solves a case instead of them. The longer the Cooper case goes unsolved, the more it will irritate them if some amateur comes up with a solution. Kenneth Christensen became a suspect when his brother Lyle was watching a TV documentary about D.B. Cooper in 2003. Lyle tried to convince the FBI of the possibility, but they were not interested in pursuing the information. Next, Lyle contacted author and film director Nora Ephron in the hopes of putting together either a book or a documentary. Nora wasn't interested either. So Lyle turned to a private investigator, Skip Portillos, who, after digging into the case, came up with a book. The book is called Into the Blast, The True Story of D.B. Cooper. In early 2001, an episode of the History Channel series Brad Meltzer's Decoded included some of the ideas put forth by Porteous. Kenneth Christensen enlisted in the Army in 1944 and became a paratrooper. After leaving the Army, he joined Northwest Orient as a mechanic in South Pacific region. He moved on to become a flight attendant and then a purser based in Seattle. Christensen was 45 years old at the time of the hijacking, but he was thought to be too short. He was 5 foot 8 inches. He was also thinner than most people had described D.B. Cooper. Keep in mind, everyone questioned as to D.B. Cooper's appearance saw him sitting down. Just maybe he had on some extra clothing under his suit to protect him from the cold weather, and this would have given him a heavier look. Kenneth was left-handed. The tie tack on Cooper's black tie showed the tie clip was applied from the left side, suggesting the hijacker was left-handed. A flight attendant, Florence Schaffner, told the reporter that the photos of Lyle Christensen fit the hijacker much closer than those of any of the other suspects she'd been shown. Christensen purchased a house using cash just a few months after the hijacking. 1994, as he lay dying from cancer, Kenneth said, "There's something you should know, but I can't tell you." Lyle said he never pressed his brother to tell him what this deep, dark secret was. After Kenneth's death, the family members found gold coins and a valuable stamp collection in Kenneth's possession. They also found he had a bank account with over $200,000 in it. And Kenneth had a folder of Northwest Orient news clippings, which began about the time he was hired in 1950s. The clippings stopped just before the date of the hijacking. Seeing as the hijacking was the most newsworthy thing ever, you'd expect Kenneth would have news clippings about it as well. The last clipping was just weeks before the Cooper story began. Despite Portillo's book and the 2011 TV documentary, the FBI refused to consider Kenneth Christensen's possibility of being D.B. Cooper. The feds say Kenneth was too well trained as a paratrooper to fit into their preconceived notion of Cooper not being a competent skydiver. That, and he was not tall enough or heavy enough to match the witnesses' statements. Marla Cooper came forward saying she had a 40-year-old family secret involving her uncle, a man named Lynn Doyle Cooper. Marla Cooper said she was 8 years old when her uncle, whom she called LD, came to her home badly injured. It was Thanksgiving 1971, the day just after the infamous incident. He told everyone he was injured from a car accident. Later, she said her parents came to believe that LD was in fact the hijacker. Miss Cooper never saw her uncle again after that day and was told he had died in 1999. Marla also recalled how two of her uncles had been practicing using handheld radios to communicate back and forth to see how far apart they could get and still talk. In addition, Marla Cooper said that her uncle was fixated on a comic book character named Dan Cooper, the name the skyjacker had given the airline before boarding. And once again, it's time for a brief pause to play some commercials and drink some coffee, so don't go away. We'll be right back after this. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Makeup isn't something you want to just smear on and hope for the best. You might come out looking like Lon Chaney. Call Lourdes James, independent beauty consultant, and get a free makeover to see how makeup should be done. 956-723-3019. Back in 1776, someone said, "Give me coffee or give me death." And if that's how you feel, you should be at the Organic Man Coffee Trike. They make coffee the right way, one delicious cup at a time. 4501 McPherson, Suite number 9. Coffee, the stuff dreams are made of. Did you go out UFO hunting and couldn't focus on the sky? Swing on by Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle del Norte, right across from the Embassy Suites. That's not a weather balloon, that's a flying saucer. And don't forget to check out the majesticalcryptid.net for all your Bigfoot and other cryptozoological creature needs. This is Arkanasa Radio you've been listening to. And welcome back to the show. And once more, we're going over just a few of the suspects in the D.B. Cooper hijacking. William Gossett was in the Marine Corps, and he was in the Army and the Air Force. He saw action in Korea and Vietnam. His military experience included advanced jump training and wilderness survival. After retiring from the military in 1973, he worked as an ROTC instructor and taught military law at Weber State University in Ogden, Utah. Later in his life, he hosted a radio talk show in Salt Lake City, which featured discussions on just about everything paranormal. During this time, he befriended a Clyde Lewis from Ground Zero Media. Gossett changed his first name to Wolfgang and then became a priest. I wonder about the name, Father Wolfgang, but maybe he changed it again. Gossett was known to be obsessed with D.B. Cooper. He amassed a huge collection of Cooper-related news articles. He supposedly told his sons, and a retired Utah judge, as well as a friend in the Salt Lake City Public Defender's Office, that he was indeed D.B. Cooper, and he had hijacked Flight 305. Photos of Gossett taken in 1971 bear a resemblance to Cooper's composite drawing. He died in 2003. Clyde Lewis did a show about D.B. Cooper and how Clyde was convinced he knew the man. If you'd like to hear the show, go to www.ground-life-with-DB-Cooper. This is one of the better podcasts regarding D.B. Cooper. Well worth listening to. I'll try to put a link to it after the show tonight. There's a story going around saying there's a letter that was written by Cooper. It was made public for the first time due to a Freedom of Information lawsuit. In the letter, obtained by filmmaker and author Tom Colbert, Cooper said he knew from the start he wouldn't be caught. Colbert has said the letter, with a memo from the FBI, shows proof the Bureau was trying to cover up certain aspects of the case. The letter also states Cooper used makeup and a toupee to throw off the investigators. When the witnesses described Cooper to the forensic artists, they would come up with a deceptive wanted poster. The letter Colbert obtained is only one of 5 letters sent by either Cooper or someone claiming to be Cooper. If the feds thought the letters were actually from Dan Cooper, why did it take a Freedom of Information lawsuit to force them to release any of this information? I know law enforcement always keeps some clues back to use for sorting out the pathological confessors who will plead guilty to just about any and every crime, but after so many years of not solving the D.B. Cooper case, shouldn't they have released the so-called Cooper letters by now? If these letters were considered to be fake, the feds should have said so, removing all of the controversy about them by now. Colbert said, "This letter proves to me that there's been a cover-up and it continues to be a cover-up in this case." These letters weren't handwritten, but letters cut from magazines and pasted together on a page. They were signed by D.B. Cooper. If you want to take a look at one of them, just type in D.B. Cooper letters and have a look. A very interesting theory was presented on Season 3, Episode 7 of Expedition Unknown with Josh Gates. Cracking the D.B. Cooper case. The theory goes, when the aft stairs were lowered over southwest Washington, it was simply a ruse. Dan Cooper stepped out onto the stairs and then he bounced on the extended platform, causing the plane to lurch. The flight crew would believe he had left the aircraft and report this to the authorities once on the ground. Dan Cooper had shown an inordinate amount of planning and pre-thought concerning his crime. He sat in the rear of the plane so few people could see him. He dressed in an unremarkable fashion. He knew the terrain around where the plane was traveling. He was familiar with the workings of the aircraft, and he knew things that the flight crew didn't know about the plane they were on. He guessed correctly the FBI wouldn't sabotage the parachutes if he asked for 4, giving the impression he was going to force one of the flight crew to jump with him. This does not look like someone who would jump into the darkness if there was an alternative available. He had ordered the plane to fly to Mexico. The pilot said it would be too far if they had to fly with the wheels down and the flaps at 15 degrees. Could Cooper have figured out ahead of time? The plane would have to land in Reno, Nevada to refuel. He knew just about everything there was to know about the plane already. Why wouldn't he know how far they could go on a full tank of fuel? Did the pilot, William Scott, come up with having to land in Reno, or did Cooper suggest it to him first? So now, Cooper's standing on the aft stairs, looking down into the darkness below, knowing there were trees and wilderness below him. Would he jump, or would he wait a bit? It was a 3 hour flight to Reno from Seattle. Cooper still had 2 hours to kill. Perhaps Cooper sat there in the rear of the plane, smoking and waiting for the right moment. He had the whole passenger compartment to himself. The flight crew were not going to take a peek to see if he was there, on the chance that he just might blow the plane to pieces. As Flight 305 was coming into Reno Airport, there would have been turbulence as the plane changed direction to line up with the runway and begin moving down towards the ground. No one would have felt the bump as Cooper used this opportunity to step off the aft stairs and parachute into the moderate brush around Arizona. This would have been a much safer and easier landing. As far as theories go, this one sounds more like the crafty skyjacker known as D.B. Cooper than hurtling himself into cold, dark forest of Washington state. Those 4 parachutes supplied to D.B. Cooper had come from a skydiving school owned by Earl Cossey. In April 2013, Cossey was found dead in his home in Woodville, Seattle. He'd been hit over the head with some form of a club. The authorities ruled it as being a homicide, but they have no suspects. This is a bit odd, but as far as connecting to Cooper, it'd be a stretch. It had been 42 years since Cooper jumped using chutes provided by Cossey. As a result of the D.B. Cooper hijacking and all the copycats who followed in his wake, FAA requires a safety device be placed on all aircraft which would prevent the aft stairs from being lowered while the plane was in flight. This device is known as the Cooper vane. After the hijacking craze, it became just a bit more difficult to travel by air. To begin with, the airlines began looking into all carry-on luggage. At first it was just a quick look, but with time it became more invasive. As the process of searching became more involved, the folks trying to sneak things onto planes became craftier. False bottoms in suitcases and briefcases. People began taping items to their bodies. The more inventive the covert carriers became, the tighter scrutiny became. The tighter scrutiny became, the more inventive ways of getting past it became. We may never know for sure who Dan Cooper really was. Until they find the rest of the money, this will remain a mystery, and I, for one, I really do enjoy a good mystery. If you enjoyed tonight's show, tell your friends. The archives, which are free, can be found at strangethings.podomatic.com. If you'd like to contact us, you can find us at strangethings@arkanasa.com or our Facebook page, Strange Things with Chris James.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man, they say murder 3? Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?